America will soon reach a remarkable milestone in its history. In just a few years, we will observe our 250th anniversary of independence. The real story of our becoming America, of course, unfolds in the years leading up to our Declaration of Independence, and then through 6 more harrowing and uncertain years of the American Revolution, and then nearly another decade of our trial and error efforts at self-government before we established our United States Constitution. That's a lot of history to commemorate. But we'll take those anniversaries as they arrive in sequence as the 250th anniversary of each event rolls across our collective calendars for the next 2 decades. And the 250th anniversary is a good time to reflect on that history and imagine ourselves living through it. Most immediately, of course, on our calendar of 250th anniversaries, we commemorate in Hillsborough the War of the Regulation, also called the Regulator Movement. This is special history unique to North Carolina in advance of the American Revolution. This history is more complicated than we think. Yes, it preceded the American Revolution, but the issues were different. And this presentation now is not to tell you the story of the War of the Regulation. Others are doing that as part of the online programming offered on this occasion. This presentation is about putting the Regulator Movement in context within that larger story we mentioned, the American Revolution, and especially that revolution as experienced in North Carolina and as of particular interest to an audience in and around Orange County. So buckle up. We have a lot to cover, and we'll move right along. We hope to make this interesting, whether you already know a lot or a little. The one cause of the American Revolution most people can name is taxation without representation. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts had all been imposed on the American colonies as a means to collect taxes. Those were needed to replenish the British coffers after what we called over here the French and Indian War. The Stamp Act had caused quite a stir in North Carolina and Wilmington in 1766. It was soon repealed, but just as soon was replaced by the Townshend Acts in 1767. Those taxes were also met with boisterous demonstrations and mostly repealed themselves by April 1770, all except a tax on tea. The end of the Townshend Acts came right after an event you may be surprised to learn happened earlier than you might have suspected, on March 5th, 1770. This was the Boston Massacre, where 5 American colonists, including Crispus Attucks, an African-American sailor, died at the hands of British troops. So yes, the 250th anniversary of one of the most infamous events of American Revolutionary lore has already passed us by on our calendar of 250th anniversaries. During the latter half of the 1760s, the Regulator Movement was building in the North Carolina Piedmont, reaching points of high tension in 1768, 1770, and finally in 1771. The tension was between 2 factions, the farmers in the back country of the Granville District and the royally appointed officers, including sheriffs, judges, registrars, and tax collectors. We might just as readily describe it as a sectional conflict, East versus West. That's because the eastern part of the state was well settled with an aristocracy of large planters and merchants dominating the colony's governance. The western part was in pioneer mode. It was an experiment in democracy of small farmers working their own land. And despite the efforts and pleadings of the backcountry citizens to establish a better regulation of government affairs, the royal governor, his provincial council, and the elected assembly, all dominated by the eastern folks, did little to address the complaints. And in fact, the authorities tended to make things worse. In 1766, the assembly approved a poll tax on each adult male to pay for building a permanent Capitol building, for storing records, and for conducting the colony's official business, so they said. Not happy with paying a tax for such a building, the citizens in the backcountry referred to their colonial capital as Tryon's Palace, with reference to William Tryon, the royal governor at the time. Some declared they would not pay that tax. But, and this is important, the regulators were not rebelling against the king or against the colonial government. The regulators just wanted their government to work as it was supposed to work, and who among us would not have wanted the same? So to get our bearings on this era before and during the Revolutionary War, let's consider what else was going on during that time from 1765 to say 1782 that offers some perspective to the Revolutionary era in North Carolina. Now bear with me here, you'll see why later. Residents of Hillsborough recognize some connection, spurious or real, to the legacy of Daniel Boone. And in the fall of 1770, Daniel Boone was in the second year of his first expedition exploring the over-mountain wilds of Kentucky, having passed through the Cumberland Gap for the first time in late spring 1769. He had left his North Carolina home on the Yadkin River at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains and set off with 5 other men to search for the Cumberland Gap into the Kentucky wilderness, where they would harvest deer skins for sale back in Salisbury. He would not return to North Carolina until the spring of 1771, when the tensions in the War of the Regulation had come to a head, but he was too far west to be involved in that conflict. During 1772, the appetite for western lands saw adventurous settlers moving into the over-mountain region of the Holston, Watauga, and Nolichucky rivers in what is now northeast Tennessee and the Holston Valley in Virginia. The settlers along the Watauga River at Sycamore Shoals formed the Watauga Association. They did so simply to organize the registering of property sold because of the difficulty of communicating with authorities in North Carolina or Virginia. Some of these men had come over the mountains to escape the aftermath of the Regulator Movement. They retained their independent spirit, and that bothered some authorities. Still, the spirit of these over-mountain settlers plays a decisive role later in the American Revolution, and you are going to love that story when we get to it. Beginning in spring 1773, the several colonies were organizing committees of correspondence to advise one another on matters related to the actions of Parliament. As in North Carolina, this was mostly the folks in the more settled parts of each colony along the coast who were involved in this, the Sons of Liberty. The people in the back country had their hands full just getting in a crop of corn or building a cabin or a barn. That December 1773, the Sons of Liberty tossed bundles of tea into the harbor during the Boston Tea Party. That brought on economic reprisals from the British ministers who closed New England's major port. Concerned, the colonies agreed to organize in Philadelphia a Congress of Representatives sent from each colony. But North Carolina's royal governor refused to convene the assembly by which they could choose representatives. Because William Tryon had moved on to be the governor of New York immediately after hanging 6 regulators in 1771, it was his replacement, who was then 3 years into his administration and dealing with these anxious citizens in 1774. In defiance of this governor's refusal to call an assembly, the leaders undertook a traitorous action, calling for their own provincial congress, holding it August 25, 1774, in New Bern, right under the nose of Royal Governor Josiah Martin. The men who attended were a who's who of those who had become North Carolina's revolutionary leadership. So many of them were also those who had served so readily under William Tryon just 3 years before in marching to Orange County to put down the protesting regulators. Politics indeed makes for strange bedfellows. As the First Continental Congress concluded in October 1774, the ladies of Edenton, North Carolina, organized their own Tea Party, boycotting purchases of tea and becoming, from the British perspective, annoyingly politically active. Meanwhile, those Philadelphia delegates had agreed they would meet again in May 1775. That turned out to be not a moment too soon. On April 19, 1775, the shooting war of the American Revolution erupted on the village greens of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. And when word of that confrontation reached the Scotch-Irish ears of Thomas Polk and his like-minded leaders in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, they fashioned and issued, many claim with credible evidence, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence more than a year before Thomas Jefferson penned what the Second Continental Congress signed as our National Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. True or not, the May 20, 1775 date of the Mecklenburg Declaration graces North Carolina's flag, of course, and is part of our state's Revolutionary War legacy, if not simply its lore. During that summer of 1775, North Carolina's royal governor Josiah Martin had devised a plan to help put down the rebellious colonies. He called it a Southern strategy. He believed the Southern colonies, North Carolina in particular, were filled with men who would rally to defend the crown. All they needed was guns and ammunition. It took some time to organize across the ocean, but eventually British ministers sent guns and ammunition and soldiers to meet whoever Josiah Martin could gather. The people he sent out into the colony to muster these men reported they expected 5,000 regulators would show up to fight for the crown. They would, after all, be fighting against the very men, these Sons of Liberty, who had led troops against them in 1771. In the plan, these regulators would be joined by Highland Scots who had migrated to the colony during the last 30 years and were dearly grateful to own land again after being so totally defeated on the moors of Culloden a generation earlier and an ocean away in 1746. So in the winter of 1776, at the muster at Cross Creek, that's today's Fayetteville, only 130 former regulators turned out and several hundred Highland Scots. North Carolina Continental troops and militiamen marched out from New Bern and Wilmington to confront this mustered group of Scotsmen and Loyalists. They clashed at the bridge over Whittemore's Creek, the first battle of the American Revolution fought in North Carolina. The Scots and the regulators were soundly defeated and chased through the countryside as they tried to get back home. Some of the Scots and Loyalist prisoners and their leaders were thrown in the jail at Halifax, where only a few weeks later the North Carolina Provincial Congress met again, voting to instruct its delegates at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia to vote for independence from Britain. We were the first of the United Colonies to do so. That was the act which earned North Carolina the claim to first in freedom. The date of those Halifax resolves is April 12, 1776. That is the other date appearing on the North Carolina flag. In the summer of 1776, as the Declaration of Independence was being written in Philadelphia, North Carolina took the war to its western reaches, deciding that the Cherokees, allied with the British, presented a threat. North Carolina militia joined in a concerted effort with militia forces from Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia to eradicate Cherokees by destroying their villages and crops and chasing men, women, and children into the forest, where the coming winter would kill them. Not a glorious moment in American history. The leader of these North Carolina militiamen was General Griffith Rutherford. The fact that his brother, Colonel Thomas Rutherford, was a principal leader mustering Loyalist forces during the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge reinforces the notion that communities were split and families were split on what each thought was the best course of action for the future of North Carolina. Become a small and vulnerable independent state with uncertain prospects, or remain a reliably safe and secure colony of the mighty British Empire. People had their own good reasons for deciding one way or the other. Back in the spring, the defeat of the Loyalists at Moores Creek Bridge and the adopting of the Halifax Resolves had soon been followed by the retreat of the royal governor from the province. He did not return to it for 4 years. Not until the fall of 1780, when the British were trying that southern strategy for a second time. Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis captured Charlestown on the South Carolina coast in May 1780. He captured as well the entire southern department of the Continental Army, some 5,000 troops. He then marched inland into South Carolina through the summer, recruiting to his ranks an army of backcountry American loyalists, people he called friends of government, the very people Josiah Martin had believed were there. These men joined Cornwallis in his attempt to sweep north through both Carolinas and into Virginia to attack George Washington from the south with an army of Americans. In the middle of August, just north of Camden, Cornwallis resoundingly defeated a reconstituted southern department of the Continental Army, marching south to confront him. The American commander, General Horatio Gates, abandoned his men on the field of battle and rode 3 days northward to the safety of Hillsborough. At that point, there was no army standing between Cornwallis and his plans to march north to attack George Washington from the south. But there were heroes waiting to take the stage in this Revolutionary War drama, and some of them had been affected by or influenced by the spirit of the Regulator Movement. Indeed, when the advancing British forces threatened to come into the over-mountain region of North Carolina to hang the leaders and lay the country waste with fire and sword, 1,000 backcountry militiamen crossed the mountains and gathered another 800 patriots to join them. After 2 weeks of pursuing the Loyalist army across the North Carolina backcountry, half of these patriot militiamen rode out through a cold, rainy night to surround and defeat British Major Patrick Ferguson in the Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7th. News of that defeat of Cornwallis's western flank came after Cornwallis had already marched into Charlottetown. And riding into North Carolina with Cornwallis was its royal governor, Josiah Martin, grateful to be reclaiming, it seemed to him at the moment, his colony from the rebels who had chased him out 4 years before. Now, as a quick aside for those who want to know more about the Battle of Kings Mountain and those men from the backcountry showing Regulator courage, you can watch a 3-video series called A New Kings Mountain Story. It is available for your free viewing this fall through the courtesy of these host organizations during these times. We are celebrating this year the 40th anniversary of the Over-Mountain Victory National Historic Trail being designated by Congress. It is a great story told along that 330-mile commemorative trail. You can watch a 6-minute trailer for the video trilogy at randalljones.com. The defeat of a third of Cornwallis's army, his western flank, at the Battle of Kings Mountain, forced the British to retreat into South Carolina to winter over. After the British loss at the Cowpens in January 1781, Cornwallis frantically pursued General Nathaniel Greene in his strategic retreat across the North Carolina countryside, an event known as the Race for the Dan. Unable to reach Greene's army across a rain-swollen river, Cornwallis occupied Hillsborough in February 1781 to rest his men and to recruit from the area. He was not very successful in increasing his ranks, declaring from Hillsborough that he found himself among timid friends. Nevertheless, even with a diminished force, Cornwallis advanced to a confrontation with Greene at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. The clash between the two armies on March 15th was stupendous, described later as long, obstinate, and bloody. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse was a technical victory for Cornwallis as he kept the field, but he had lost a quarter of his men. Greene had lost only 1 out of 16 and had withdrawn confident and knowing the damage that he had done to the British force. From the battlefield, Cornwallis tried again to recruit more men to his cause, calling for men to take a part in restoring good order and government. Again, the response was slight, causing him to declare, "I could not get 100 men in the Regulators' country to stay with us." Deciding then that he could not win in North Carolina, Cornwallis marched his men down to Wilmington, where they resupplied and reordered themselves. He prepared there to invade Virginia. One of the Loyalists scouting for Cornwallis was also one of the great guerrilla fighters for the Loyalist cause in North Carolina, David Fanning. During the summer of 1781, with some British forces remaining in Wilmington, Fanning harassed Whig communities throughout the Middle Counties. In September 1781, with Cornwallis in Virginia and marching toward Yorktown, David Fanning mustered over 1,000 Loyalists in North Carolina. They undertook their boldest raid. On September 12th, this force of some 1,200 Loyalists slipped into Hillsborough under the cover of fog. They captured the town. They released captured Loyalists from the jail, and they took some 200 Whigs as prisoners, including some Continental officers, some of the governor's council members, and members of the General Assembly. Fanning's biggest prize was Governor Thomas Burke, who lived just outside Hillsborough. Fanning's Loyalist militiamen plundered Hillsborough that morning, including confiscating the supplies of liquor they could find. They then rode away on the Cape Fear Road, bound for Wilmington. The next day, a rallied Whig army ambushed Fanning at the ford on Cane Creek at Lindley's Mill in South Alamance County. This 4-hour battle was one of the bloodiest in North Carolina's Revolutionary experience, with casualties compared to participants exceeding those at Guilford Courthouse. But the Whigs did not rescue the governor. Thomas Burke was taken to Wilmington and then paroled to James Island near Charlestown, South Carolina. His harassment there by Tory refugees prompted him to escape and thus break his parole, an act of dishonor for which he was severely criticized by his fellow patriot gentlemen of North Carolina. He resumed his duties as governor, but the ordeal and debts broke him. He left the governorship in April 1782 and died the following year, not yet 40 years old. Cornwallis's army had departed Wilmington in April 1781, advancing toward and into Virginia. In June, he sent the notorious Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton and his Green Dragoons on a secret raid to capture Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson in Charlottesville. Jefferson escaped from his Monticello home by only minutes, but while in Charlottesville, Tarleton did take one prisoner of note for our story, Daniel Boone, then serving as a member of the Virginia legislature elected from the frontier of what would in time become Kentucky. Soon enough, Cornwallis in Virginia was trapped on the York Peninsula in a siege held by Continental and French troops. French ships had blockaded entrance to the river, preventing Cornwallis's escape or the arrival of British aid. On October 19, 1781, the British troops surrendered to General George Washington. The American Revolution continued on in small skirmishes for several months in the overmountain wilderness of Kentucky and in South Carolina. In Kentucky, Daniel Boone fought in the last battle of the American Revolution in August, where his second son was killed fighting next to him. In South Carolina, General Greene chased the British back into Charlestown until the British forces and many American loyalists evacuated their last stronghold in December 1782. Then came the challenge of putting North Carolina back together and building a new nation from among the separate free states. And that, as we say, is another story. So we hope you enjoy learning about the Regulators at this 250th anniversary of their grassroots efforts to get their government to do the right thing. To many, it seems that challenge might be a continuing struggle in America, and there is plenty of history to bear that out. Real history, factual history, on which we can reflect in the coming years as a grand series of 250th anniversaries of our founding events roll across our calendars. Please keep watching to see a 6-minute trailer for the new Kings Mountain Story video trilogy, sharing the exciting story of the backcountry patriot heroes, their resolve and their courage reflecting the Regulator spirit, who turned the tide of the American Revolution in 1780 at the Battle of Kings Mountain. The Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780 was the turning point in the Southern campaign of the American Revolution. This was a victory hard won by citizen militiamen alone, patriots who responded to the call to fight for freedom in the face of an advancing British army. The story of the gathering of these backcountry militiamen, including those from the Overmountain region, is so ably told today along the 330-mile commemorative route of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, the first National Historic Trail established east of the Mississippi River. As our most special National Historic Trail was designated by the United States Congress in the fall of 1980, we celebrate this fall, 2020, the 40th anniversary of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail. And to help all Americans commemorate this special part of America's Revolutionary War history, we offer this video trilogy. And for those who think they already know the story of the Battle of Kings Mountain, we invite them to expand their understanding across new landscapes and about new heroes through these 3 videos. In the summer of 1780, during the Revolutionary War, British forces marched through South Carolina, gathering an army of Americans still loyal to the King. British Major Patrick Ferguson threatened to burn the homes and to hang the leaders of the backcountry patriots in the Overmountain region of North Carolina. Never fearful of such a threat, 1,000 patriot militiamen marched across the Appalachian Mountains to track down the arrogant major. They caught up with Ferguson and his loyalist army atop Little Kings Mountain on October 7th. All sides of the mountain were shrouded in a thickening haze of gunpowder smoke. The patriot militiamen advanced up the mountainside, moving with skill from tree to rock to tree and firing their hunting rifles with deadly accuracy. The Loyalists charged down the hill with the cold steel of bayonets affixed to their muskets. But brave and determined, the patriots would not be denied. Each man advanced under his own command. Each fought with courage and skill and commitment. But the outcome of the battle in the American Revolution was uncertain until the last. The heroic story told along the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail gets even better with the revelation of new information. This new history now takes us onto adjacent landscapes where a broader, bolder Kings Mountain story unfolds. Citizen militiamen from other parts of the backcountry were mustering and moving toward Quaker Meadows to join up with the Overmountain men. The footprints of over a quarter of the men who fought at Kings Mountain can now be added to the story, a story we can tell beyond that celebrated trail corridor. Because, as we now know, these Kings Mountain veterans marched as far as anyone else to get to a battle that was in their own backyard. And the leadership of South Carolina Militia Colonel James Williams now comes to the forefront in our understanding of how all these backcountry militiamen planned and accomplished their heroic feat, the one Thomas Jefferson said helped turn the tide of the American Revolution. Alongside our traditional Kings Mountain story of courage, determination, and relentless pursuit in the backcountry, we can now tell a broader, bolder Kings Mountain story. The Kings Mountain story continues well after the victory atop that summit on October 7th. During the following 2 weeks, the victorious militiamen marched away 800 Loyalist prisoners, fellow Americans who suffered a death march of starvation and harassment. Some angered patriots wanted revenge against these men who had killed some of their friends and family during the battle. Nearly 36 of these problem Tories were condemned to hang after they faced a questionable trial before Patriot officers. Victors and prisoners alike slogged anxiously through a rain-soaked night to cross the rising Catawba River, exhausted, before they could be trapped against it by a pursuing bloody Bannister Tarleton and his Green Dragoons, who were feared coming to rescue the prisoners. A week later, after marching down the Yadkin River, this horde of tired, cold, and hungry men descended upon the unsuspecting Moravians at Bethabara, where these German-speaking Christians, as was their faith and practice, fed, sheltered, and cared for the rowdy victors and frightened prisoners alike for several weeks during times of continuing turmoil and uncertainty in North Carolina's backcountry. So join us now in celebrating all the Patriot heroes of our new Kings Mountain story during this 40th anniversary of the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail. Watch all 3 videos, read the books, and support the organizations hosting this video presentation for you and your community. Huzzah!